I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years.
And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, after watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
Today, this Friday in early January, stands as an especially dark and consequential day for Sean Combs. Out of absolute nowhere, with zero build-up and zero fanfare, Netflix has released what 50 Cent is already calling the authentic next chapter in the ongoing documentary project titled The Reckoning. There was no weeks-long promotional campaign. There was no ominous teaser trailer dropped across platforms. There was no countdown clock ticking in the corner of social media feeds. The entire piece simply appeared on the service one ordinary morning, as though it had always been waiting there. And when something this substantial arrives wrapped in such complete and deliberate silence, the viewing public does not respond with casual indifference. People lean in hard. That specific flavor of quiet almost always functions as its own form of announcement. The creators and those closest to the material already know precisely how much gravity, how much latent force, is packed inside every frame. This new installment is not being presented or marketed as a typical sequel crafted primarily to entertain, to thrill, or to provide easy emotional catharsis. From the opening seconds, it registers instead as something far more deliberate, a direct continuation explicitly designed to disturb whatever fragile equilibrium had recently settled over the public conversation. More than anything else, it serves as a stark, unblinking reminder that the original documentary release never truly constituted a final chapter or a clean resolution. It was only a pause. A long, strategic intermission. The deepest impact of this new material lives not in any single moment of shock value or previously unseen bombshell evidence, but rather in the razor-sharp intentionality of its timing. The first installment of the series landed at the precise moment when public attention was still raw, still inflamed, when fresh court filings, leaked communications, daily news cycles, televised proceedings, and endless online speculation were still flooding every screen, every timeline, every group chat. This second chapter arrives now, during a markedly different season, a time when the overwhelming majority of observers had already mentally filed the entire matter away, when most people had quietly concluded that the story had finally run its course, exhausted its oxygen, and receded into the background hum of yesterday's controversies. That dramatic contrast in timing is anything but accidental or haphazard. Narratives, especially uncomfortable ones, strike with maximum force and maximum staying power precisely when people have stopped actively bracing for impact, when psychological defenses have been lowered, when everyday routines have returned and the collective attention span has drifted elsewhere. That core psychological mechanism is exactly why this particular day carries an entirely different emotional temperature than anything that preceded it. 50 Cent is not framing or positioning this release as a fresh, frontal assault or a public demolition job. He is presenting it instead as essential, unavoidable, expanded context, footage that could not be responsibly included in the original cut, recorded conversations that were never intended to be played back-to-back, visual records and chronological sequences that only begin to reveal their true cumulative weight and meaning when they are finally forced into close, unrelenting proximity with one another. Certain names, certain venues, certain recurring social configurations, certain high-profile moments begin to appear far too consistently, far too insistently, to be plausibly dismissed as coincidence or chance. Nothing in the presentation is shouted at the audience. No red circles. No dramatic arrows. No sensational on-screen captions screaming, "Look here." Nothing is labeled or spoon-fed. And that complete, almost militant refusal to dictate how the viewer should emotionally interpret what they are seeing is precisely what makes the entire experience grow steadily more unsettling with every passing minute. When the work itself refuses to tell you how you ought to feel, your own mind and your own instincts begin to fill the vacuum, and those internal responses often land much harder, much deeper, and much more persistently than any externally imposed direction ever could. Before we descend any further into the layers of what this chapter is actually doing, if this breakdown is resonating with you and you want to stay locked in as this story continues to accelerate, please take a moment right now to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on all notifications. Things are moving very quickly from this point forward, and the most important future developments are extremely unlikely to arrive with loud advance publicity or clear warning signs. What immediately distinguishes this installment from virtually every other documentary sequel or follow-up special is the extraordinary, almost surgical degree of restraint that governs every single editorial choice. This is not constructed as a fast-cut, high-energy montage packed with fresh allegations, emotional ambush moments, or rapid-fire gotcha clips. The dominant organizing principle throughout is proximity, temporal proximity, spatial proximity, professional proximity, social proximity. The film repeatedly places the viewer inside tightly overlapping orbits. Who was physically standing next to whom at critical junctures, how frequently those same orbits intersected across months and years, how relentlessly certain elite social and professional circles kept folding inward upon themselves, decade after decade. When Jay-Z's name surfaces within the material, and it does surface repeatedly, it is never treated as the central explosive headline or framed as the primary target. Instead, his presence emerges slowly, organically, almost inevitably through shared performance stages, mutual high-profile events, overlapping guest lists at private gatherings, joint business ventures, recurring public appearances, and dozens of documented moments that were always part of the open public record, yet were almost never before deliberately arranged in tight chronological and thematic parallel for direct comparison. That specific stylistic restraint, that refusal to sensationalize or editorialize, is the primary reason the audience reaction has fractured so dramatically and so immediately. A very large segment of viewers watches the material and concludes there is virtually nothing new here. They recognize the archival clips, the familiar interview soundbites, the well-worn red carpet footage, the same old photographs. Another very large segment, looking at exactly the same body of material, suddenly perceives clear, insistent, repeating geometric patterns that, once recognized, become extraordinarily difficult, almost impossible, to unsee or to forget. This chapter pointedly refuses to demand formal verdicts from the audience. It advances no explicit legal accusation. It offers no singular smoking gun moment engineered to force instantaneous judgment. What it accomplishes instead is something psychologically far more invasive and enduring. It systematically collapses artificial distance. It directly, quietly, relentlessly challenges the deeply ingrained cultural assumption that the simple passage of enough years, enough news cycles, enough distractions automatically dissolves unresolved tension, automatically neutralizes lingering questions, automatically brings closure. And the precise moment viewers begin to internalize that the true subject of this work is not ultimately one solitary central figure, but rather the vast protective architecture of prolonged, coordinated silence that has long surrounded and insulated an entire professional ecosystem, the emotional atmosphere inside the viewing experience changes in a deep, almost physical way. Once silence stops registering as an innocent, natural, default condition of public life and celebrity culture, every single piece of archival material, every glance held a second too long, every carefully worded half-answer, every abrupt pivot away from a dangerous subject, begins accumulating additional layers of gravity and implication. And once that fundamental perceptual threshold has been crossed, the narrative no longer requires dramatic escalation, new leaks, or fresh headlines to remain potent and unavoidable. Its continued, stubborn, unapologetic existence is sufficient to sustain pressure. That is the fundamental reason this particular date feels so disproportionately consequential, not because the entire world flipped upside down in 24 hours, but because whatever elements of the story had been deliberately left dangling, deliberately left unresolved, deliberately left in limbo, have quietly walked back into the center of the room and are now refusing to leave again. What gives this new chapter its noticeably heavier emotional and intellectual density is its absolute, uncompromising refusal to hurry past even the smallest detail. The pacing has been intentionally, almost aggressively decelerated. Individual moments are allowed, encouraged, to breathe far longer than conventional documentary editing rhythm would ever tolerate. Clips are not aggressively chopped, sliced, or diced for maximum dramatic punch. Many sequences are deliberately permitted to run just long enough for the attentive viewer to consciously register precisely what is almost always trimmed away in standard post-production. The micropauses that reveal hesitation, the fleeting micro-expressions that betray discomfort, the subtle yet utterly consistent ways in which conversations begin to drift sideways, upward, or backward the instant they brush against anything even remotely resembling real clarity, real finality, real accountability. This entire structure is not built around the familiar Hollywood fantasy of one single killer clip that retroactively rewrites the entire historical record in a blaze of revelation. It is constructed instead around a much more sobering, much more uncomfortable, much more adult observation. Almost nothing of genuine substance ever fundamentally shifted or resolved, because almost nothing of genuine substance was ever fully, publicly, transparently confronted. As the runtime slowly unfolds, a pattern begins to coalesce and solidify without ever being formally announced or labeled. The same opulent environments keep reappearing like ghosts. The same tightly interlocking social constellations keep reforming in frame after frame. The same critical junctures, precise moments when definitive explanations, definitive clarifications, definitive closures could have been offered to the public, keep surfacing again and again, only to be neither explicitly denied nor substantively clarified nor decisively closed, but simply, calmly, consistently left floating in deliberate, open-ended ambiguity. Questions that are never publicly closed do not quietly evaporate with the passage of time. They persist. They deepen. They metastasize. Especially when the same names, the same faces, the same centers of power continue to resurface across entirely different years, entirely different headlines, entirely different cultural flashpoints, always linked by clear, documented, demonstrable proximity rather than by transparent, detailed, satisfying explanation. The most quietly devastating and disorienting aspect of the entire viewing experience is how strangely familiar, how almost inevitable, how eerily preordained the whole arrangement begins to feel once the scattered fragments of the past are finally forced into tight, deliberate, side-by-side alignment. None of the material presented here is framed or marketed as shocking new evidence suddenly unearthed from secret archives or hidden hard drives. It is presented instead as recovered, recontextualized memory, things that millions upon millions of people already saw in real time, briefly registered, casually shrugged off, and moved past because the individual moments never felt urgent enough, pressing enough, dangerous enough to demand sustained, collective attention. Yet authentic urgency does not always arrive wearing a megaphone or wrapped in breaking news graphics. Sometimes it arrives belatedly, stealthily, when artificial chronological distance and artificial thematic distance suddenly collapse entirely and everything is forced to rest directly beside everything else in unforgiving proximity. That is precisely the psychological instant when passive, nostalgic memory stops being passive and begins functioning as active, almost forensic, almost prosecutorial analysis. This chapter deliberately occupies and ruthlessly weaponizes that deeply uncomfortable psychological territory. It refuses to accuse directly. It refuses to editorialize heavily. It refuses to preach. It simply observes with clinical patience. And then it allows the sheer cumulative weight of repetition, repetition of faces, repetition of settings, repetition of evasions, repetition of silences, to carry the overwhelming majority of the persuasive and interpretive burden. How frequently the same individuals materialize in frame without adequate surrounding context or explanation. How reliably meaningful silences descend immediately after potentially revealing exchanges. How consistently the broader entertainment industrial complex has placed its long-term faith in the supposed healing powers of time rather than in the clarifying, resolving, sometimes painful power of direct, detailed, public answers. The authentic, enduring strength of this installment resides not in any single dramatic, viral revelation, but in the ruthless clarity and precision of alignment. When previously isolated, disconnected, comfortably distant fragments are finally compelled to touch one another, to sit shoulder to shoulder, they begin to alter each other's meaning retroactively and irreversibly. And once that relational transformation registers in the viewer's mind, even subconsciously, returning to the earlier, more comfortable, more disconnected mode of passive consumption becomes psychologically almost impossible. The central emotional and intellectual question quietly mutates, from the relatively straightforward, what actually happened back then, to the far more dangerous, far more enduring, far more structural set of questions: why was meaningful follow-through perpetually postponed? Why were substantive explanations consistently deferred year after year? Why was chronological distance, emotional distance, informational distance systematically permitted to substitute for genuine public resolution? In this newly activated perceptual framework, silence no longer reads as neutral background noise, as the natural absence of comment. It begins to appear purposeful, not necessarily evil or conspiratorial in intent, but unmistakably strategic, unmistakably calculated, unmistakably functional in execution. That profound shift in interpretation lies at the very heart of the sharply divided audience reactions we are seeing unfold in real time. One large camp watches and sees only recycled, familiar, already seen archival material. The other large camp experiences something far more tectonic and lasting, a fundamental reorientation of how they now understand years, even decades, of carefully managed public behavior. Because at its absolute core, this chapter is not primarily about establishing courtroom-level legal proof of anything specific. It is about manufacturing sustained, inescapable, compounding pressure, the precise kind of pressure that inevitably builds when previously unfinished, previously suspended, previously ambiguous narratives are finally and firmly denied the long-standing luxury of remaining conveniently unresolved simply because enough calendar pages have turned and enough news cycles have moved on. That pressure does not need to detonate, does not need to explode, does not need to go viral in order to remain profoundly significant. It only needs to persist. It only needs to endure. What changes most deeply and most permanently in this installment is the entire conceptual framing of responsibility itself, not as a simplistic binary of clear-cut guilt versus clear-cut innocence, but as repeated, documented, demonstrable presence. Who remained consistently visible in the frame during periods of maximum public ambiguity and scrutiny? Who stayed prominently, profitably in the spotlight when circumstances were flattering, advantageous, or lucrative, yet became noticeably less available, less responsive, less present when genuine clarity would have required more than a single carefully worded sentence or a brief, managed statement? This chapter does not aggressively push new accusations forward into the public spotlight. Instead, it patiently, methodically, almost tenderly draws accumulated context backward through time. It invites, indeed almost compels, the audience to revisit moments that had previously been declared finished, over, settled, and to recognize, often with growing discomfort, how little was actually resolved in any meaningful, public, verifiable sense. Slowly, inevitably, unavoidably, the attentive viewer begins to perceive how much of the modern entertainment ecosystem is quietly constructed upon deliberately incomplete fragments. Isolated video clips surgically separated from their full surrounding dialogue, headlines surgically divorced from any meaningful follow-up or correction, interviews that perpetually promise, "We'll address this fully later," while that promised later somehow never arrives, year after year after year. Taken completely on their own, each individual fragment appears harmless, forgettable, routine, unremarkable. Placed in deliberate, sustained proximity with all the others, they begin to suggest not chaos, not accident, but something significantly closer to consistent institutional policy, the consistent, repeated absence of any real external pressure to bring contentious, uncomfortable, potentially damaging stories to full public completion. Full resolution was never structurally required when reputation, legacy, momentum, brand value, and professional relationships could reliably carry the weight instead. This marks the decisive, irreversible pivot in audience focus, from charismatic individual personalities to the invisible but extraordinarily powerful systems that quietly incentivize prolonged silence far more generously, far more consistently, far more reliably than they ever reward thorough, transparent, sometimes costly public explanation. Systems that have learned through long, hard experience exactly how rapidly public outrage ignites and then dissipates, and exactly how dependably the mere passage of time blunts discomfort, erodes curiosity, and allows inconvenient questions to fade into background static. The documentary never needs to articulate these structural observations out loud. It never needs to lecture. It simply demonstrates them through relentless, unblinking, almost hypnotic repetition, the same practiced deflections appearing again and again, the same carefully calibrated half-responses recycled across years, the same unruffled composure that calmly assumes no clarification is necessary because none was ever previously demanded or expected. What makes the entire experience so quietly devastating, so psychologically invasive, is precisely how normal, how institutionalized, how utterly routine and business as usual the entire behavioral pattern appears once you stop looking away and start really looking. No visible panic on camera. No frantic scrambling in the edits. No desperate attempts at damage control. Just a calm, practiced, almost architectural reliance on every conceivable form of distance. Distance between the events themselves, distance between serious public inquiry and substantive public response, distance between what the public was allowed to witness in real time and what the public was ultimately permitted to understand in fullness. That same multi-layered, multi-decade distance was once widely interpreted as emotional maturity, as professional sophistication, as high-class restraint. Now it registers increasingly as sophisticated insulation, protective architecture carefully designed to shield the interior from sustained, serious, unrelenting external scrutiny. As viewers, we are not being instructed to pick a side in some simplistic, binary morality play. We are being quietly but persistently and relentlessly asked to observe recurring patterns of behavior across time. Who consistently engages deeply and substantively when the subject remains comfortable, superficial, and career positive? Who provides detailed, specific, granular explanations when pressed, and who reliably, habitually allows time itself to serve as the default, all-purpose answer? These recurring behavioral tendencies do not constitute formal legal accusations. They do not need to. They simply reveal priorities. And priorities, when observed consistently across many years and many different pressure points, eventually tell their own independent, extremely stubborn, extremely durable story. The longer the material runs, the more undeniable and inescapable one central reality becomes. Silence in this specific context was never merely an accidental narrative gap. It operated as a deliberate, repeatable, highly effective method, a dependable institutional mechanism for allowing contentious moments to slide past without ever requiring formal public resolution, confidently betting decade after decade that human memory would fade much faster than persistent, organized curiosity ever could. But memory did not fade this time. It accumulated. It stacked. It layered. And accumulated, stacked, layered moments eventually stop feeling coincidental. They stop feeling random. They start feeling structural. They start feeling systemic. That is precisely the point where the underlying tension begins to deepen, not through sudden shock value, not through viral outrage, but through slow, steady, irreversible recognition. Recognition that authentic, enduring power rarely bothers to hide inconvenient facts outright. Far more often, it simply manages, masterfully, patiently, professionally, how those facts are framed, sequenced, spaced apart, contextualized, and ultimately interpreted. And once that long-standing interpretive control begins to erode, even slightly, even subtly, long familiar footage starts acquiring new density, new implications, new emotional and intellectual weight. Not because it suddenly proves something previously unknown to everyone, but because it stubbornly, quietly, relentlessly refuses to disappear back into the historical background where it once comfortably resided for so many years. That, ultimately, is the profound but almost imperceptible shift that is taking place right now, in real time. The volume has not increased dramatically. The outrage has not exploded. But the depth has. The attention has lengthened. The memory has sharpened. And once those things happen, nothing needs to be shouted for the pressure to continue building. The story simply has to keep existing. And it is.